Beneath the sands of Persia lie tablets that scholars have barely touched. Clay and stone inscribed with symbols that bridge two of humanity's oldest religious traditions. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, they inherited more than territory. They inherited the gods, the Anunnaki, those mysterious divine beings whom the Sumerians believed descended from the heavens to shape human destiny, didn't simply vanish when Cyrus the Great rode into Mesopotamia. They transformed. They merged with something older, something the Zoroastrian priests had always known. Tonight, we trace the thread between two ancient worlds, following whispers preserved in tablets that have waited millennia for translation, asking a question that haunts the archaeological record. What did the Persians truly know about the beings their conquered subjects once called the Anunnaki? There is a particular quality to the light in the lands between two rivers. When the sun descends toward the western horizon, and the sky turns the color of old bronze, and the dust that has accumulated over thousands of years seems to hang suspended in the air like a veil between the present moment and all the moments that came before. The Tigris and the Euphrates have carved their paths through this landscape since before human memory began to record itself in clay and stone, and the waters that flow through them have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations whose names we struggle to pronounce and whose gods we struggle to understand. If you were to stand on the banks of either river at twilight and let your gaze drift eastward across the flat expanse of what was once called Mesopotamia, you would eventually find your eyes lifting toward the distant silhouette of mountains that mark the edge of another world entirely. Those mountains belong to the Iranian plateau, and behind them lies a civilization just as ancient and just as mysterious as the one that flourished in the river valleys below. Tonight, we are going to travel between these two worlds, and we are going to ask a question that has haunted scholars and seekers for generations. We are going to ask what happened when the religion of Persia encountered the mythology of Babylon, and specifically, we are going to ask what the Persians knew about those enigmatic divine beings whom the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. The answer to this question is not simple, and in truth it may not be fully recoverable because so much has been lost. The history of the Avesta, which is the sacred scripture of the Zoroastrian faith myth, remains unknown until the first manuscripts appear many centuries after the religion was founded, and the period following the fall of the Sasanian Empire saw a pronounced deterioration of the Avestan corpus, so that summaries preserved in texts from the 9th and 10th centuries indicate that the Sasanian Avesta was much larger than the collection of texts that survives today. We are working with fragments. We are working with echoes. We are working with the traces left behind when libraries burned and empires crumbled and priests died before they could pass their knowledge to the next generation. But fragments can be illuminating, and echoes can carry truth across vast distances of time. And so we begin our journey here at twilight, standing between two rivers and two mountain ranges and two religious traditions that would eventually collide in one of the most consequential moments of ancient history. Let us first turn our attention to the land where writing was born and where the gods descended from the heavens to walk among humanity. Let us turn to Mesopotamia and to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are a group of deities who appear in the religious texts of the ancient Sumerians and their cultural successors, the Akkadians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who built their civilizations in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates over a span of nearly 3,000 years. In the earliest Sumerian writings about them, which come from the period after Akkadian influence had begun to shape Mesopotamian culture, the Anunnaki are described as deities within the broad pantheon, and they are identified as descendants of An, who was the god of the heavens, and Ki, who was the goddess of the earth. Their primary function, according to these ancient texts, was to decree the fates of humanity, which means that these were not distant or abstract divine forces, but rather active participants in the ordering of human life and death and destiny. The precise meaning of the term Anunnaki remains a matter of scholarly debate, and the most commonly accepted translation suggests something like princely seed or princely offspring, which emphasizes their divine lineage and their royal status among the gods. But the number of these gods and their individual names and their specific functions vary considerably according to the limited historical texts that scholars have managed to recover and translate over the past 2 centuries of archaeological work in the region. Among the gods named in some texts as members of the Anunnaki, we find Enlil, who was the god of air and wind and breath, and who was credited with separating heaven from earth at the beginning of time. Enlil is generally regarded as the most prominent of the Anunnaki in the earlier periods of Mesopotamian religious development, and his temple at Nippur was one of the most important religious centers in the ancient world. We also find Ea, who is sometimes called Enki, and who was the god of wisdom and fresh water and magic and craftsmanship. Ea was associated with the Abzu, which was the primordial freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the earth, and from which all springs and rivers ultimately derived their waters. The goddess Ninhursag appears among the Anunnaki as well, and she was associated with fertility and mountains and wild animals and the nursing of kings and gods alike. Sin, who was also called Nana, was the moon god and the father of the sun god Shamash, who was also known as Utu, and who represented justice and truth and the all-seeing eye that observed human actions from above. And then there was Ishtar, who was also called Inanna, and who was perhaps the most complex and fascinating of all the Mesopotamian deities. Ishtar was the goddess of love and beauty and sex and fertility, but she was also the goddess of war and political power. And she was associated with the planet Venus, which appears as both the morning star and the evening star. The stories told about Ishtar reveal a deity of tremendous ambition and passion and willfulness, and one of the most famous of these stories describes her descent into the underworld, where she encountered the Anunnaki in a very different role than the one they played in the upper world. The Babylonian creation story, which scholars call the Enuma Elish, and which was recited during the New Year festival in Babylon, contains a remarkable passage in which the god Marduk, who had risen to supremacy in the Babylonian pantheon, assigned 300 Anunna gods for duty in the heavens, and the same number for duty in the netherworld, giving a total of 600 Anunna gods distributed between the upper and lower realms of the cosmos. This suggests a vast divine bureaucracy with hundreds of deities working to maintain cosmic order and oversee the affairs of humans and spirits alike. But in the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld, we encounter only 7 Anunnaki, and they reside within the underworld itself and serve as judges of the dead. When Inanna descends through the 7 gates of the underworld and arrives before the throne of her sister Ereshkigal, who rules that dark realm, she must stand trial before these 7 judges. The Anunnaki examine her case and deem her guilty of hubris for attempting to extend her power into a domain that was not her own, and they condemn her to death. Her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld, and it is only through the intervention of Ea and the creation of special beings to retrieve her that Inanna is eventually restored to life. This story tells us something profound about the Anunnaki and their role in Mesopotamian religion. They were not simply powerful gods who ruled from above, but were also associated with judgment and death, and the boundaries between different realms of existence. They determined fates and enforced limits, and they punished those who transgressed the cosmic order, even when the transgressor was herself a great goddess. These are the beings whose worship dominated the religious life of Mesopotamia for millennia, and these are the beings whose temples and statues and sacred precincts would come under Persian control when Cyrus the Great rode into Babylon in 539 BCE. But before we follow that story, we must turn our attention to the other civilization that concerns us tonight. We must travel east across the plains and into the mountains and discover what was happening in the religious life of ancient Persia during these same centuries when the Anunnaki ruled the spiritual imagination of Mesopotamia. Zoroastrianism was founded by a prophet whose name has come down to us in various forms. The Greeks called him Zoroaster, and this is the name most commonly used in English. But in the original Avestan language, he was called Zarathustra, and in later Persian, he was called Zartosht. The precise date of his birth and his prophetic ministry remains one of the most contested questions in the study of ancient religion, and estimates vary wildly, from as early as 2000 BCE to as late 200 years before Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. Most scholars today favor a date somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE, but certainty remains elusive. What we do know is that Zoroaster was born somewhere in the eastern regions of the Iranian world, perhaps in what is now northeastern Iran, or perhaps in what is now southwestern Afghanistan, and that he was born into a culture that already possessed its own religious traditions. These earlier Iranian traditions shared a common heritage with the Vedic religion that would later develop into Hinduism, and both traditions derived from the ancient Indo-Iranian religion that was practiced by nomadic herding tribes who had migrated across the vast grasslands of Central Asia in the 2nd millennium BCE. The religious culture into which Zoroaster was born featured polytheistic worship of many divine beings, and it included practices that Zoroaster would later reject, including what he regarded as excessive animal sacrifice and the excessive ritual use of intoxicating substances. Zoroaster experienced a series of visions and revelations that transformed his understanding of the divine order, and these revelations form the basis of the religious tradition that bears his name. At the heart of Zoroastrianism is a collection of sacred hymns called the Gathas, and these hymns are thought to be in the main the very words of Zarathustra himself, preserved and transmitted through countless generations of priests and worshippers. The Gathas are written in a very ancient form of the Avestan language and represent some of the oldest religious poetry in the Indo-Iranian tradition, comparable in age and linguistic character to the oldest hymns of the Indian Rigveda. When we read the Gathas, we are hearing a voice from the deep past, and we are encountering a religious vision of remarkable originality and power. The central revelation of Zoroastrianism concerns the nature of the divine and its relationship to the forces of chaos and destruction that threaten the cosmos. Zoroaster proclaimed the existence of a supreme deity called Ahura Mazda, whose name means Lord of Wisdom, and who represented the source of all that is good and true and orderly in the universe. Ahura Mazda was not merely the chief god among many gods as An or Enlil might have been understood in Mesopotamian religion, but was rather the uncreated creator from whom all beneficial existence derived. Opposed to Ahura Mazda was Angra Mainyu, whose name is sometimes translated as destructive spirit or hostile spirit, and who represented the source of all that is evil and false and chaotic in the universe. Zoroastrian doctrine holds that within this cosmic dichotomy human beings have a choice to make, and this emphasis on moral choice and individual responsibility represents one of the most revolutionary aspects of Zoroaster teaching. Humans can choose Asha, which means truth or cosmic order, and which is the principle of righteousness that is promoted and embodied by Ahura Mazda. Or humans can choose Druj, which means falsehood or deceit, and which is the essential nature of Angra Mainyu that expresses itself through greed and wrath and envy. This choice is not merely philosophical or abstract, but has real consequences for the fate of the soul after death and for the ultimate resolution of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Zoroastrianism thus represents one of the first and most influential examples of ethical dualism in the history of religion, and its influence would eventually extend far beyond the borders of Persia to shape the development of Judaism and Christianity and Islam in ways that scholars are still working to understand. Fire played a central role in Zoroastrian worship as a symbol of truth and righteousness and the presence of Ahura Mazda, and the fire temples that the Persians built throughout their empire became some of the most recognizable features of their religious landscape. When we imagine the Iranian plateau in the centuries before the Persian Empire rose to power, we should imagine scattered communities of worshippers gathering around sacred fires on hilltops and in specially constructed temples, singing hymns that praised Ahura Mazda and rejected the false gods whom they called devas. This word deva is fascinating because it is cognate with the Sanskrit word deva, which in the Indian tradition refers to the gods themselves. What was divine in India became demonic in Persia, and this linguistic evidence suggests that Zoroaster revolution involved a radical revaluation of the beings that his ancestors had worshipped. The old gods were not simply forgotten, but were transformed into adversaries of the new supreme deity. And this pattern of transformation and demonization would become relevant when Persia expanded westward and encountered the gods of other peoples. We have now established the two religious worlds that concern us. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki and their fellow deities ruled from their temples and received the worship of millions across a civilization that had endured for thousands of years. In Persia, Ahura Mazda was proclaimed as the one true God, and the followers of Zoroaster looked forward to a day when the forces of truth would triumph finally over the forces of falsehood. These two worlds existed separately for centuries, each developing its own traditions and its own sacred texts and its own ways of understanding the relationship between the divine and the human. But history was about to bring them together in a collision that would reshape the ancient world and leave traces that we are still trying to decipher today. The question we must ask as we move forward is what happened when the armies of Persia conquered the cities of Babylon, and what happened when the priests of Ahura Mazda encountered the worshippers of the Anunnaki. Did they simply ignore each other? Did they fight? Did they find ways to reconcile their different visions of the divine order? And most intriguingly, did the Persians record what they learned about these ancient Mesopotamian gods in texts that have survived only partially or not at all? The tablets that might answer these questions are scattered across the museums and archives of the world, and many of them have never been fully translated. As we continue our journey, we will explore what has been recovered, and we will wonder together about what has been lost. But first, let us rest here for a moment at the threshold between two worlds and let the weight of these ancient mysteries settle upon us like the dust that drifts through the twilight air in the lands between the rivers. In the autumn of 539 BCE, the ancient world witnessed one of those rare moments when the entire shape of human civilization pivots on the actions of a single army marching through a single gate. And on that day, when Cyrus the Great of Persia entered the city of Babylon through its massive Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks depicting dragons and bulls sacred to the Babylonian gods, something far more profound than a mere change of rulership was set into motion. For this was not simply one empire absorbing another. This was the collision of two entirely different ways of understanding the cosmos, two different answers to the fundamental questions that human beings have always asked about the nature of divinity, the purpose of existence, and the relationship between mortals and the powers that move unseen through the world. Babylon, in that autumn, was already ancient beyond imagining, a city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years, a city whose priests had recorded the movements of stars and planets for centuries, whose libraries contained clay tablets inscribed with hymns and rituals and myths stretching back to the very dawn of writing itself. And within those libraries, preserved in the great temple complexes dedicated to Marduk and the other gods of Mesopotamia, were the records of beings called the Anunnaki, the divine council, that had, according to Babylonian belief, shaped human destiny from the beginning of time. The priests who tended those temples, who recited those ancient liturgies, who knew by heart the stories of how the Anunnaki had decreed the fates of kings and nations, must have watched with profound uncertainty as the Persian soldiers filed through the streets. For they could not have known what these conquerors from the Iranian highlands believed about the gods. They could not have known whether the new masters of Babylon would honor the old ways or sweep them aside. And indeed, the Persians brought with them a religious tradition that was in many ways utterly foreign to everything the Babylonians understood about divinity. The Indo-Aryan peoples who had settled the Iranian plateau had always differed in their worship from the Semitic peoples of Mesopotamia and the Levant. Their gods bore names that echoed those found in the Vedic scriptures of distant India, Mitra and Varuna and Indra, and above all others, Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, whom the prophet Zarathustra had proclaimed as the one true God, the source of all light and truth and righteousness. This was a fundamentally different theological vision than anything the Babylonians knew for, while Mesopotamian religion embraced a vast pantheon of deities, great and small, each with their own domains and personalities and rivalries. The religious tradition that the Persians carried with them tended towards something approaching monotheism. or at least a form of worship, in which one supreme deity stood so far above all others that they became almost like angels or servants rather than independent gods in their own right. Cyrus himself presents us with a fascinating puzzle. For while later Persian kings would explicitly declare their devotion to Ahura Mazda in their royal inscriptions, Cyrus seems to have been more circumspect, more willing to speak the language of whatever people he ruled in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, that remarkable clay document that some have called the first declaration of human rights. Cyrus presents himself not as a champion of Ahura Mazda, but as the chosen one of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. He claims that Marduk looked across all the lands searching for a righteous king and chose Cyrus to restore proper worship to the city. This was likely political pragmatism, the words of a shrewd conqueror who understood that empires are held together not only by force but by the willing cooperation of subject peoples. Yet it also raises intriguing questions about what Cyrus actually believed and about how the earliest Achaemenid rulers navigated the complex religious landscape of their vast domains. What we know with greater certainty is that by the time of Darius I, and certainly by the reign of his son Xerxes, the Achaemenid kings had fully embraced the teachings of Zarathustra and saw themselves as the earthly champions of Ahura Mazda in his cosmic struggle against Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the lord of lies and chaos. This was not merely a private religious conviction, it was a political ideology, a sense of what we might call religious manifest destiny that informed every aspect of how these kings understood their role in the world. And it is here that the collision between Persian and Mesopotamian worldviews becomes most fascinating. For when you believe that you are fighting on behalf of cosmic truth against cosmic falsehood, what do you make of the gods worshipped by the peoples you have conquered? Are they simply other names for the divine forces you already recognize? Are they lesser spirits, servants perhaps of the great Ahura Mazda? Or are they something else entirely? Are they the devas, the demons, the false gods that Zarathustra warned his followers against? And if the Anunnaki, those ancient divine judges who had held court in Babylonian theology for millennia, were perceived as devas, then what does that tell us about how Persian priests understood the religious traditions they had inherited along with the territories they now administered? The encounter between these two priestly traditions, the Persian magi and the Babylonian clergy, must have been one of the most remarkable interfaith dialogues in human history. Though dialogue may be too gentle a word for what was surely a complex negotiation of power, knowledge, and survival, Herodotus, the Greek historian who remains our primary source for much of what we know about this period, tells us that the Magi were originally one of the 6 tribes of the Medes, and that they wielded considerable influence at the courts of the Median emperors even before the rise of the Achaemenid Persians. These were not simple village priests, but a sophisticated learned caste who had memorized vast bodies of sacred text, who understood the movements of celestial bodies, who claimed the ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods. They were, in other words, very much like their Babylonian counterparts, men of learning, men of power, men who understood that knowledge of the divine was itself a form of authority. And so, when Persian rule extended over Mesopotamia, these two priestly castes found themselves in an unprecedented situation, forced to coexist within the same imperial structure, forced to confront the fact that the other possessed ancient wisdom, that could not simply be dismissed or ignored. The children of priestly families began learning sacred texts by heart at a very young age, following their own family traditions. And given the poor communications of the ancient world, it would have been practically impossible to make an existing priesthood abandon the traditions they had memorized in favor of some newly imposed official version. The Magi had their own practices derived from the ancient Indo-Iranian religious matrix, while the Babylonian priests had theirs, stretching back to Sumerian times. And the earlier inhabitants of the land, the Elamites, had possessed their own professional priesthood, the Shatin, adding yet another layer to this complex religious landscape. We can only imagine the conversations that must have taken place in temple precincts and palace chambers. When learned men from these different traditions encountered one another, did they compare their cosmologies? Did they notice the parallels between their different accounts of creation and flood and divine judgment? Did the Magi ask the Babylonian priests about the Anunnaki? And if so, what did they learn? The historical record does not preserve these conversations for us, but it preserves something perhaps equally revealing. It preserves the evidence of what happened next. The gradual transformation of how Persian rulers spoke about the gods of their subject peoples. And nowhere is this transformation more starkly visible than in the reign of Xerxes, who inherited from his father Darius both a vast empire and an uncompromising devotion to Ahura Mazda. Xerxes did not share the tolerant pragmatism of Cyrus, who had been willing to speak the language of Marduk to win Babylonian hearts. His policy seems to have been one of actively installing the worship of Ahura Mazda, where previously other gods had been worshipped, the gods of the conquered peoples, those beings whom Babylonians had venerated for millennia. Xerxes dismissed with a single word Devas, the Avestan term for false gods, demon spirits of destruction and chaos, in a remarkable inscription that has survived to our own time. Xerxes records his actions with startling bluntness. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, he declares, I destroyed that establishment of the Devas, and I proclaimed the Devas, thou shalt not worship. This is one of the most significant religious proclamations in ancient history, and its implications for our understanding of what happened to the Anunnaki in Persian consciousness are profound. For if the gods of Babylon were Devas, then the Anunnaki, those divine judges, those decreers of fate, those children of heaven and earth, would necessarily have been included in that category. They would have been transformed in Persian eyes from divine beings worthy of reverence into adversaries of the cosmic order, spirits aligned with Angra Mainyu against the forces of truth and light. This theological transformation echoes something very ancient and very widespread in the religious history of the Near East, the pattern by which one culture's gods become another culture's demons. The ancient Hittites and Hurrians, whose mythologies refer to a set of former gods banished to the netherworld by a newer generation, eventually identified those former gods with the Anunnaki themselves. This suggests that even before the Persian conquest, there was something about the Anunnaki that lent itself to this kind of transformation. Something about their association with the underworld, with judgment, with the chthonic depths that made them available as figures of the vanquished divine order. The gods who had ruled before the current gods came to power, and now, under Achaemenid rule, this transformation was being enacted again. The Anunnaki, who had been judges, were perhaps becoming the judge divine beings whose worship was forbidden, whose temples were destroyed, whose very names were being recast as words of ill omen. Yet we must be careful here, for the relationship between Persian religion and Mesopotamian tradition was never simple, never merely one of conquest and suppression. The same kings who proclaimed their devotion to Ahura continued to rule from Babylon, continued to maintain the administrative structures that the Babylonians had developed, continued in many ways to rely on Babylonian scribes and Babylonian learning to govern their empire, and those Babylonian scribes continued to copy their ancient texts, continued to preserve the hymns and myths and ritual prescriptions that their ancestors had preserved for generations before them. The tablets did not all burn. The priests did not all fall silent. Somewhere in the complex negotiation between Persian power and Mesopotamian tradition, the old knowledge survived, sometimes openly, sometimes in disguise, sometimes in forms so transformed that only the most careful scholarship can recognize the ancient sources beneath the later accretions. This is the mystery at the heart of our inquiry. Not simply what the Persians believed about the Anunnaki, but what happened to that belief. As centuries passed, as empires rose and fell, as the tablets were copied and recopied, translated and mistranslated, lost and found, and lost again, the collision between these two great religious traditions did not end with a clear victory for either side it produced. Instead, something new, something hybrid, something that contained within it elements of both Mesopotamian polytheism and Zoroastrian dualism. And it is in the spaces between these traditions, in the tablets that were never fully translated, in the texts that were lost when Alexander burned Persepolis, that the deepest mysteries still reside, waiting perhaps for some future scholar to piece together the fragments and tell us at last what the Persian priests truly knew about the beings their Babylonian subjects had once called the Anunnaki. There is a moment in the story of every civilization when the fire comes, and what comes after is silence. And in the case of ancient Persia, that moment arrived in the year 330 before the Common Era, when a young Macedonian king, whose own people would call him great, led his armies through the ceremonial gates of Persepolis and watched as flames consumed one of the greatest repositories of sacred knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. The Zoroastrian tradition remembers this differently than the Greek historians do, and the difference in memory tells us something profound about the nature of loss and the weight of what vanishes when libraries burn. While Western sources celebrate Alexander as a conqueror of legendary proportion and a spreader of Hellenistic culture, the Persian religious texts that survived the centuries use a different word for him entirely, and that word is Gizistag, which translates roughly as the accursed. And in that single epithet, we can hear the echo of grief that persisted for generations among the priests and scholars who understood what had been destroyed. According to the Middle Persian tradition, the original Avesta was not merely a collection of hymns and prayers, but a comprehensive library of sacred knowledge comprising 21 separate books called nasks. And these nasks were said to contain everything from the original revelations of Zoroaster himself to detailed cosmological teachings about the nature of creation, to legal codes governing every aspect of human behavior, to astronomical observations, to medical knowledge, to the very secrets of existence itself. The tradition holds that Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrian faith, had communicated this knowledge directly to Zoroaster, who in turn transmitted it to his patron King Vishtaspa, and from that royal court, the teachings spread throughout the Iranian world, eventually becoming the spiritual foundation of the Achaemenid Empire. 2 copies of this vast corpus were said to exist, and the numbers involved are staggering to contemplate because the texts were reportedly inscribed upon 1,200 ox hides, which, when you pause to imagine the physical reality of such a document, represents an almost inconceivable wealth of recorded wisdom. 1 copy resided in the imperial treasury, where it was presumably guarded with the same vigilance wasp afforded to gold and precious gems, and the other copy was kept in a house of archives, a library in the truest sense of the word, where priests and scholars could consult the sacred texts, and where the knowledge could be copied and transmitted to the next generation of believers. And then Alexander came, and both copies were lost. The precise circumstances of the destruction remain somewhat unclear, filtered as they are through centuries of oral tradition and theological interpretation. But the Zoroastrian sources are consistent in attributing the catastrophe to the Macedonian conquest, and specifically to fires that consumed Persepolis, either deliberately set or allowed to burn unchecked, while Alexander and his companions celebrated their victory. Some later accounts suggest that portions of the Avesta dealing with scientific matters, such as astronomy and medicine, were deliberately separated from the religious texts and carried off by Greek scholars who recognized their practical value, even if they cared nothing for Persian theology. And this detail, if true, adds another layer of tragedy to the story, because it implies a kind of intellectual plundering that accompanied the physical destruction. The religious heart of the texts, the hymns and prayers and mythological narratives that gave meaning to Persian spiritual life, went up in smoke, while the technical knowledge was scattered across the Mediterranean world, absorbed into Greek learning, and eventually lost to its original context. But we must be careful here, because we are dealing with memory and tradition rather than documented historical fact, and the relationship between what actually happened in 330 BCE and what later Zoroastrian sources claimed had happened is complex and perhaps unknowable. Some modern scholars have suggested that the tradition of Alexander destroying a written Avesta may itself be a later development, and that the religion was primarily transmitted orally for much of its early history, with the story of the burned ox-hide manuscripts serving as an explanation for why so much sacred knowledge seemed to have been lost. The Zoroastrian tradition adapted its own narrative over time, incorporating the existence of written scriptures and explaining their absence by pointing to Alexander as the destroyer, and whether or not there were physical manuscripts of the scope and scale described in the later sources. Something was certainly lost during the Macedonian conquest. The living chain of oral transmission was broken, as priests were killed or scattered, and temples were destroyed, and the carefully maintained continuity of teaching from master to student was severed in ways that could never be fully repaired. When we speak of 3/4 of the original texts being lost, we are not engaging in metaphor or exaggeration, because scholars who have carefully compared the references to Avestan literature in later Pahlavi commentaries with the texts that actually survive have concluded that we possess only a fraction of what once existed. The 9th and 10th century commentators who wrote in Middle Persian frequently quoted or paraphrased passages from Avestan texts that simply do not appear in any surviving manuscript, and this tells us that even after the Sasanian revival, which we will come to shortly, there were texts in circulation that have since vanished entirely. Juridical texts dealing with religious law seems to have been especially vulnerable to loss, as have historical and legendary narratives that might have shed light on how the Persian priests understood their relationship to the older religious traditions of Mesopotamia. When scholars today attempt to reconstruct the contents of the original 21 Nasks, they must work backward from fragmentary references and tantalizing hints, and the picture that emerges is of a literature that addressed virtually every dimension of human existence, from the cosmic to the mundane, and all of it is gone now, except for the portions that were deemed essential for liturgical purposes and were therefore committed to memory by generations of priests who kept the flame burning, even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. The silence that followed Alexander lasted for centuries, and during those centuries the Persian world was transformed first under the rule of Alexander's successors, the Seleucids, and then under the Parthian dynasty, which arose from the northeastern regions of Iran and gradually reclaimed the ancient heartlands. The Parthians were not indifferent to Zoroastrian tradition, but they ruled over a diverse empire that included Greeks and Babylonians and many other peoples, and the old religion existed in a diminished state, competing for attention with other cults and philosophies. But then, in the year 224 of the Common Era, a new dynasty arose from the province of Fars, the very region where Persepolis had once stood. And these new rulers, the Sasanians, deliberately set out to revive the glory of the Achaemenid past, including its spiritual foundations. The Sasanians made Zoroastrianism the official state religion, and they undertook what may have been the most ambitious project of textual recovery in the ancient world. Imagine the task that faced the priests of the early Sasanian period as they attempted to gather together the scattered fragments of their sacred heritage, and this was not simply a matter of collecting manuscripts, because the tradition had been primarily oral, and what they needed to recover were the memories of aging priests who had learned their portions of the liturgy from their fathers, in chains of transmission that stretched back centuries. The Sasanian Avesta was assembled from these fragments and memories, and it represented both a triumph and a tragedy, because while it preserved what could be preserved, it also fixed in written form a corpus that was already incomplete. Around the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, the priests developed a new alphabet specifically designed to capture the sounds of the Avestan language with precision. And this Avestan script allowed them to create a comprehensive written edition of the sacred texts for what may have been the first time in history. This is a crucial turning point in the story because it separates the purely oral phase of transmission from the written phase. And it means that whatever variations or elaborations might have existed in different priestly lineages were now standardized into a single authoritative version. The Sasanian Avesta was a monumental achievement, but we must remember that it was created from the remains of something much larger, and the priests who compiled it were themselves aware that they were working with fragments. They organized the material according to their best understanding of how the original 21 nasks had been structured, but they could not restore what had been lost, and some of the nasks existed only as titles attached to vague descriptions of contents that no living person could any longer recite. The king at the time of this compilation reportedly ordered 2 copies made and deposited in the royal archives. And here we see an echo of the earlier tradition about the Achaemenid copies, as if the Sasanians were consciously attempting to recreate what Alexander had destroyed. These copies were transmitted through the royal lineage until the final days of the empire, and then came another catastrophe, because in the 7th century the Arab conquest swept across Persia, bringing Islam and transforming the religious landscape of the region forever. The Sasanian Avesta itself was lost at some point after the fall of the empire, and the oldest manuscript of any Avestan text that survives today dates from the year 1323, which means there is a gap of more than 700 years between the Sasanian compilation and our earliest physical evidence of what that compilation contained. What we possess today are copies of copies made in India by the Parsi community, who fled Persia after the Islamic conquest and maintained their ancestral religion in exile. And these texts have been edited and recopied and transmitted through their own centuries of difficulty. And the question of how faithfully they represent the Sasanian original is one that scholars continue to debate. The texts that survived are primarily those that were most essential for religious practice, including the Yasna, which contains the liturgy for the main Zoroastrian ceremony, and the Vendidad, which deals with laws of purity, and the Yashts, which are hymns addressed to various divine beings. These are beautiful and important texts, but they represent the minimum necessary for maintaining religious observance rather than the full scope of Zoroastrian learning. And when we read them, we must always remember the vast shadow of everything that has been lost standing behind them. The survival of these particular texts owes much to the fact that they were portions most usually committed to memory by the priesthood because they were recited regularly in ceremonies, and this created a kind of natural selection in which the most frequently used texts were the most likely to be preserved, while texts that were consulted only occasionally or that dealt with matters beyond the immediate needs of ritual practice gradually faded from memory. The liturgy survived because it was performed, and the ceremonies continued, and the prayers were repeated, but the astronomical treatises and the historical chronicles and the detailed mythological narratives that might have explained so much about Persian theological thinking in relation to other traditions were apparently not essential enough to the daily practice of the faith to warrant the enormous effort of memorization required to preserve them. We arrive now at the most tantalizing portion of our inquiry, which concerns the tablets and manuscripts that exist, but have not been adequately studied, and the vast realm of what might still be, waiting to be discovered or to be properly understood. The study of Zoroastrian literature has historically been the province of a relatively small number of specialists, and the languages involved present formidable challenges that have limited the pool of scholars capable of undertaking the work. The Avestan language itself is known only from religious texts, and the absence of any secular literature or inscriptions means that scholars must reconstruct the grammar and vocabulary entirely from the sacred corpus, which creates obvious circularity problems in interpretation. Pahlavi or Middle Persian is somewhat better attested, but it still requires years of specialized study to read with confidence, and the number of scholars in the world today who can work fluently with these texts is probably smaller than the number who can read ancient Sumerian or Akkadian. This means that the pace of translation and publication has been slow, and there are manuscripts in collections around the world that have been photographed and catalogued, but never fully translated, and passages that have been translated but never adequately explained, and references in later texts to earlier sources that have never been properly investigated. Only a handful of contemporary Iranists are studying questions related to the implications of early oral transmission for our understanding of these texts, and this represents a significant gap in our knowledge, because the recognition that the texts were oral before they were written should change how we interpret every aspect of their content and structure. The administrative tablets from the Achaemenid period present another largely untapped resource, because while we have extensive archives from Persepolis and other sites that document the economic and administrative activities of the empire in remarkable detail, these tablets are written in Elamite and Aramaic and Babylonian and Old Persian, and the task of synthesizing this material into a comprehensive picture of Achaemenid religious policy is still ongoing. These tablets give us internally produced information about that crucial period between 550 and 450 BCE, when the Persian Empire was consolidating its rule over Mesopotamia, and when Zoroastrian priests must have been grappling with the question of how their faith related to the religions of their subject peoples. We know from the inscriptions of kings like Darius and Xerxes that Ahura Mazda was proclaimed as the supreme deity, and that the worship of devas or false gods was condemned. But the tablets could potentially tell us much more about how this theology was implemented in practice, and what happened when Persian administrators encountered the temples and priests and sacred traditions of Babylon. The relationship between the elevation of Anu in late Babylonian religion and the position of Ahura Mazda in Persian religion has been a subject of scholarly speculation, and while some have argued that the Babylonians were imitating Persian theology, others have suggested that the Persians may actually have encouraged the worship of Anu as a way of limiting the influence of Babylon and its Marduk-centered cult on the inhabitants of other Mesopotamian cities. The truth may be more complex than either of these positions allows, and it may involve a kind of mutual influence and adaptation that is difficult to untangle from the fragmentary evidence. When we ask what the Persian priests knew about the Anunnaki, we are asking a question that falls into the vast dark space between the texts that survive and the texts that were lost, and we must acknowledge honestly that we do not know and may never know the full answer. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the very fact that so much has been lost means that we cannot rule out the possibility that detailed discussions of Mesopotamian theology and its relationship to Zoroastrian concepts once existed in texts that have not survived. The priests who served in Babylon under Persian rule must have been aware of the Anunnaki and of the elaborate mythology that surrounded them, and it would be strange indeed if this awareness left no trace in Persian religious thinking. Perhaps those traces were recorded in the lost Nasks dealing with cosmology or history, or perhaps they were transmitted orally in teachings that were never written down, or perhaps they were deliberately suppressed, as the demonization of foreign gods became official policy under rulers like Xerxes. We simply do not know, and this not knowing is itself a kind of knowledge, because it reminds us of how much of the ancient world remains hidden from us, and how provisional all our reconstructions must be. The tablets that nobody has translated may contain clues that would illuminate these questions, or they may turn out to be routine administrative documents of no theological significance whatsoever. And until the work is done, we exist in a state of suspended possibility where almost anything might be true. There is something peaceful in accepting this uncertainty rather than forcing premature conclusions. And perhaps the mystery itself is part of what draws us to these ancient traditions, because in their silences and gaps we can sense the presence of something vast and profound that exceeds our ability to fully comprehend. The fire that burned at Persepolis destroyed more than manuscripts, and what was lost was not merely information, but a whole way of understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it. And we who come after can only stand at the edge of that absence and wonder at what once filled it. Now we arrive at a place of patterns, where the threads we have followed begin to weave together into something larger than any single strand. And we find ourselves standing between two great religious traditions, looking for the echoes that pass between them, the shapes that repeat across centuries and across the boundaries of language and empire, and the slow drift of peoples across the ancient world. Let us begin with the sky, for both traditions looked upward and saw divinity there, saw a supreme being who dwelt in the heavens and from whom all other sacred powers descended. In Mesopotamia, this was Anu, the Sky Father, the most ancient of the great gods, whose name simply meant heaven and whose authority was so absolute that even the mightiest of the younger deities ruled only by his consent. The Sumerians placed Anu at the apex of their pantheon, and though he was a distant god, rarely intervening directly in human affairs, his position was unassailable, the foundation upon which all other divine relationships were built. Now consider Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of Zoroastrian faith, who dwells in endless light, who created all that is good, who stands as the unchallenged supreme deity of the Persian religious tradition. The parallels are not perfect, for Ahura Mazda is far more active in the moral life of the cosmos, engaged in an eternal struggle against the forces of darkness in a way that Anu never was. Yet the structural similarity remains compelling. Both traditions placed at their summit a sky god of absolute authority, a figure from whom lesser divine beings derived their power and their legitimacy. Both conceived of the heavens as the dwelling place of the highest divinity. Both organized their pantheons, or in the Zoroastrian case, their hierarchies of spiritual beings, in ways that descended from this supreme celestial source. When Persian priests encountered Babylonian religion, when they walked through the temple precincts and heard the old hymns sung to the old gods, they would have recognized this shape, this architecture of the sacred that placed the sky at the apex of all things. But the parallels extend further into the divine councils that both traditions describe, the gatherings of sacred beings who determine the fates of mortals and the course of the world. The Anunnaki, as we have seen, functioned in many Mesopotamian texts as precisely such a council. They were the great gods who assembled to decree destinies, to judge the living and the dead, to render verdicts that no mortal could appeal. In the underworld texts, 7 Anunnaki sit as judges of the dead, weighing the souls that descend into darkness. In the creation narratives, the Anunnaki gather to assign roles and duties to one another, to establish the order of the cosmos. Now turn to Zoroastrianism and consider the Amesha Spentas, the bounteous immortals who surround Ahura Mazda and serve as the principal agents of his will. There are 7 of them in the traditional counting, 7 great spiritual beings who each embody an aspect of divine goodness and who each protect a domain of the created world. Vohumana, good mind; Ashavahishta, best righteousness; Spenta Almighty, holy devotion; Kshatravirya, desirable dominion; Halvatat, holiness; Amaritat, immortality; and Spenta Manu, the Holy Spirit, sometimes identified with Ahura Mazda himself. 7 Amesha Spentas surrounding the supreme god, 7 Anunnaki sitting in judgment in the underworld. The number may be coincidence, or it may be one of those deep patterns that emerge when human minds contemplate the sacred, when we reach for structures to organize the overwhelming complexity of the divine. Beyond the Amesha Spentas are the Yazatas, the beings worthy of worship, a broader category of sacred entities who serve Ahura Mazda and support the cosmic order. Mithra is among them, and Anahita and dozens of others whose names appear in the Avestan texts. They form a kind of divine assembly, a celestial court that mirrors in some ways the gatherings of the Mesopotamian gods. Scholars have noted these structural similarities for generations, though they debate endlessly what they mean. Some argue for direct influence, suggesting that as Zoroastrianism developed in the centuries after Persian contact with Mesopotamia, it absorbed and transformed elements of Babylonian religious thought. Others maintain that both traditions drew independently from older Indo-Iranian and Semitic sources, that the similarities reflect not borrowing but parallel evolution from common ancestors. Still others suggest that certain patterns in religious thought are simply human, arising wherever minds contemplate the divine, and that councils of 7 and hierarchies, descending from sky fathers, are as natural to religious imagination as rivers flowing to the sea. We cannot resolve these debates tonight, and perhaps resolution is not the point. The patterns themselves are what matter, the recognition that these 2 great traditions, for all their differences, share a grammar of the sacred, a way of organizing divine reality that suggests either conversation between them or common ancestry beneath them both. And then there is the flood. Every culture of the ancient Near East, it seems, remembered a time when the waters rose and the world was unmade, when divine anger or divine necessity brought destruction upon humanity, and only a chosen few survived to begin again. The Mesopotamian flood story is among the oldest we possess, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in older Sumerian and Akkadian versions, telling of Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, who built a great boat at divine command and rode out the deluge while the rest of humanity perished. The Anunnaki appear in some versions of this tale, weeping as they watch the destruction they have decreed, regretting the severity of their judgment even as the waters rise. And in Iranian tradition, we find a different flood, or rather a different catastrophe that rhymes with the flood in its essential structure. The Vendidad tells of Yima, the first king, who ruled over a golden age when death and disease were unknown and the earth grew so full of life that it had to be enlarged 3 times to contain all the living. But Ahura Mazda warned Yima that a great winter was coming, a winter that would destroy all life on earth, and commanded him to build a vara, an enclosure, and to gather within it the seeds of all plants, and the finest specimens of all animals and the best of humanity, to preserve them through the destruction to come. The Vara is not a boat, and the winter is not a flood, but the pattern is unmistakable. Divine warning, a chosen preserver, seeds of life gathered against catastrophe, survival while the world outside perishes, renewal after destruction. These stories may share a common ancestor, some ancient Near Eastern narrative of cosmic catastrophe that each culture inherited and transformed according to its own religious grammar. Or they may represent independent responses to real catastrophic flooding in the ancient world, to the inundations that periodically devastated the low-lying lands between the rivers. Or they may arise from something deeper still, from the human need to imagine both endings and new beginnings, to believe that even total destruction contains within it the seeds of renewal. When Persian priests read or heard the Babylonian flood stories, did they recognize their own Vara narrative within them? Did they see Utnapishtim as a distant cousin of Yima, two heroes performing the same sacred function in different mythological languages? We have no text that records such a recognition, no tablets where a Zoroastrian sage explicitly compares the two traditions. But the priests were learned people. They were trained to notice patterns in sacred narratives, to draw connections between disparate stories, to find the hidden unities beneath surface differences. It would be strange if they failed to notice what seems so obvious to us. And this brings us to the central question we have been circling throughout our journey, the question that may never have a definitive answer. What did the Persians actually know? What did those priests and scholars and administrators understand about the relationship between their faith and the religions of the peoples they ruled? The Persian Empire was, among its many other qualities, a crucible of religious contact. For the first time in history, a single political authority stretched from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush, from the steppes of Central Asia to the cataracts of the Nile. Within this vast territory lived worshippers of 100 different gods, practitioners of traditions that stretched back millennia before Cyrus was born. The Persians, particularly under Cyrus and Darius, adopted a policy of relative religious tolerance that allowed these traditions to continue, that even supported the restoration of temples and the continuation of local cults. But tolerance does not mean indifference. The administrators of this vast empire needed to understand the peoples they governed. The priests needed to account for the spiritual landscape of the lands where Zoroastrianism now held political power. And both would have encountered again and again references to the old gods of Mesopotamia, to the Anunnaki and their kin, to the elaborate cosmologies that had dominated religious thought in those lands for thousands of years before the Persians arrived. We have administrative tablets from the Achaemenid period that show Persian authorities engaging with local religious institutions, managing temple economies, regulating priestly activities. We have inscriptions where Persian kings invoke Ahura Mazda while simultaneously acknowledging the existence of other gods. We have archaeological evidence of Persian officials participating in Babylonian religious ceremonies, of cultural exchange that went beyond mere tolerance into something approaching engagement. But what we lack, and this is the great gap in our knowledge, is any extensive theological reflection from the Achaemenid period itself. Any texts where Zoroastrian thinkers explicitly discuss how their faith relates to the religions of their subjects. The Avesta, in the form we possess it, is concerned with Zoroastrian belief and practice, not with comparative religion. The administrative tablets record economic and political matters, not theological debates, and the original texts, the lost nasks that might have contained such discussions, are gone, burned or crumbled, or scattered beyond recovery. So we are left to speculate, to imagine what those conversations might have been. When a Zoroastrian priest heard a Babylonian colleague describe the Anunnaki as the judges of the dead, did he think of the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, where souls in Zoroastrian tradition face judgment after death? When he heard of the Anunnaki decreeing the fates of mortals, did he recognize something like the Amesha Spentus, the divine council that surrounds Ahura Mazda? When he learned that certain Anunnaki had been banished to the underworld, demoted from their former glory, did he see in them reflections of the Daivas, the old gods who had been cast down and demonized in Zoroastrian tradition? These are questions we cannot answer with certainty. The tablets that might have answered them, if they ever existed, have not survived. The oral traditions that might have preserved such discussions were disrupted by centuries of conquest and conversion and cultural transformation. We are left with fragments, with patterns, with the tantalizing sense that connections existed that we can no longer fully trace. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the nature of this inquiry is such that certainty would diminish rather than enhance it. The mystery of what the Persians knew about the Anunnaki is part of a larger mystery, the mystery of how ideas travel across cultures, how gods transform as they cross linguistic and political boundaries, how religious traditions absorb and transform the traditions they encounter. These are processes that resist simple documentation, even when the documentation exists. They happen in conversations that no one records, in the slow drift of assumptions that no one notices until they have already changed. What we can say is that the potential for such transformation existed, that Persian and Mesopotamian religions coexisted for centuries in conditions that would have encouraged comparison and exchange, that the patterns we can observe suggest some kind of relationship, even if we cannot specify its exact nature. The Persians ruled Babylon for 200 years before Alexander came. That is long enough for generations of priests to grow up in a world where both traditions were present, where the hymns to Ahura Mazda and the hymns to Marduk were both sung within the boundaries of a single empire. What emerged from that long coexistence? What understandings or misunderstandings or creative syntheses arose? We can only glimpse through the fragments that remain. And now the night grows deep, and we have traveled far, from the reed marshes of Sumer to the fire temples of Persia, from the tablets buried in Mesopotamian tells to the manuscripts that survive in Parsi communities half a world away from their ancestral home. We have followed threads that sometimes led somewhere and sometimes dissolved into darkness, asked questions that sometimes had answers and sometimes opened only onto deeper questions. This is the nature of studying the ancient world. We work at the edges of knowledge, piecing together fragments, building hypotheses that the next discovery might confirm or demolish. The tablets we have discussed tonight, the ones that nobody translated, some of them remain untranslated because no one has had the time or resources to study them. Some remain untranslated because the languages they are written in are imperfectly understood, because the scribes who wrote them used dialects or technical vocabularies that modern scholars have not yet mastered. Some remain untranslated because they are damaged, broken, worn by the millennia they spent beneath the earth, readable only in fragments that tantalize without revealing. And some, perhaps, hold secrets we have not imagined, connections and concepts and cosmologies that would transform our understanding of the ancient world, if only we could read them. The Earth still holds such tablets. Every year, archaeologists uncover new inscriptions, new manuscripts, new fragments that add to our knowledge and complicate our certainties. The archives of museums hold collections that have never been fully catalogued, let alone studied. The deserts of Iraq and Iran still yield their treasures to those who know where to look and have the patience to dig. Somewhere in that vast repository of the unread and the partially read and the imperfectly understood, there may be texts that answer our questions about what the Persians knew about the Anunnaki, that document explicitly the theological conversations we have been imagining, that preserve the voices of priests and scholars who grappled with these very questions 3,000 years ago. Or there may not. The texts may simply not exist, destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remains. Or perhaps never written in the first place because the conversations happened only in speech, in debates around temple fires that left no record except the changes they wrought in the minds of those who participated. We cannot know, and in that unknowing there is a kind of peace. We have done what we can with the materials available to us. We have traced the patterns, noted the parallels, acknowledged the gaps. We have resisted the temptation to fill those gaps with certainties we cannot support, to claim knowledge we do not possess. And now we rest, here at the end of our journey, beneath the same stars that shone over Babylon and Persepolis, over ziggurats and fire temples, over priests who knew things we have forgotten and wondered about things we still wonder about today. The ruins sleep, the tablets wait, the mysteries remain, not as frustrations but as invitations, calling to future generations of scholars and dreamers who will take up where we have left off, who will read what we could not read, who will ask questions we have not yet thought to ask. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, in that vast archive of all that has been thought and said and imagined since humanity first looked up and wondered, the Anunnaki and the Yazatas and Ahura Mazda and Anu and all the divine beings we have spoken of tonight continue their existence, whatever form that existence takes, whether in the memories of the faithful or in some realm beyond our knowing, watching as they have always watched, keeping their own counsel, holding their own secrets, waiting with the patience of eternity for us to understand what they have always known. Rest now. The night is gentle, the ancient ones keep their vigil, and in the morning, perhaps, we will remember what we dreamed.